Good evening. Welcome to the Finance and Operations Committee meeting. Hello, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Lee. How are you doing today, gentlemen?
Doing well.
Mr. Rogers, can you begin with an overview of your agenda, please?
Tonight we have three agenda items. The first is a use of facilities. It's informational. The second is a informational update on upcoming audits. And the third is board action for policy review.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed with your first item.
So again, our first item tonight is informational. It's in regards to use of facilities, and it is just an update to the public and the board that we want to make the public again, and again, the board aware that as the district's been investing in our facilities, whether it be the buildings or the fields, more specifically the high school track and field, the turf field, and we're putting millions of dollars into these facilities, we want to set an expectation that any kind of use of these facilities will fall under certain rules and regulations and also a fee structure. So we want the community to know that currently fields don't necessarily have a fee directly associated with using them unless it's for personnel that needs to be on site for the use of those facilities. But something like our new high school field and track will start to require a fee and also personnel to be on site to make sure that the organizations using this sites are using them appropriately. A good example of that is our new track, the Mondo surface, requires that runners cannot use metal cleats on the track. It will actually deteriorate the track faster and in turn require the district to replace it sooner. So it is highly recommended that metal spikes are not used. That's one small example, but that's really why we're here tonight, and just to quickly update the public and the board so that they understand that in the future we are moving in a direction of assessing fees for uses of those types of facilities, and also making sure we'll make it very clear through the Leisure Services Department that there are ways, appropriate uses of those facilities.
So just a comment, obviously we've invested a lot of money in upgrading our facilities, and we want to make sure people respect the sanctity of those facilities and we maintain them appropriately. Since they'll have to go through Leisure Services to actually secure using them and adhere to the new fee structure, will there be instructions on things like that you talked about as far as the type of cleats that need to be used on the track? Will that be included in the applications when they fill it out to actually secure the facility?
Absolutely. And we also expect any organization using that field to have a meeting with Leisure Services and have it explained to them. We also will be posting proper use of specifically the track's more concerning when it comes to footwear. When it's an organized activity, you can really direct the focus of how to use it. If there was a track meet, we could obviously have, some schools will have somebody there to check cleats. So there's almost like a check-in station for a track and field team, and they have to show which cleats they're using to ensure they're not using metal spikes. The more concerning part would be something like a community member who maybe is off from school in the summer and is a college runner and comes out to run on the track. So we would want to make sure there's signage so that people understand that whether it's an organized event or not, you cannot be using that surface with a metal cleat.
Thank you.
So we are also working on the gym. We made a lot of investment in the gym floor. So we are inventorying every single equipment that we're using in the gym. So we will tag each item with a remove, replace, keep, or repurpose. So we will be able to keep the condition of the gym floor. And also we will be having an operational plan and also communication plan. So all the users that are using our gym is aware of what they are supposed to do in our gym.
So are you thinking of a separate special application for the field and the track, or are we still thinking of the same application but just a little bit of a different process?
The application would stay the same as it is right now, unless there was some kind of future change that was proposed. But we have the ability within the way the policy and applications written to assess fees for any kind of maintenance that's associated with a facility.
I could just jump in, Dr. Taylor, your question is important, that we also have to track the hours. So believe it or not, the football field, after a certain number of hours, requires us to groom it for the use and the warranty that's on that field and the track as well. So we're going through training for that. As Marvin Lee had discussed at the high school floor, we took a lot of pride in redoing the floor. We want to protect that floor. That's a $50-some thousand investment, so we don't want to, even for pictures, walking on high heels on the floor and things like that. So our training about how we're handling these things and then communicating that back out with an expectation of somebody overseeing it, you don't want to see these things destroyed. We want to get the lifespan out of these. And also, we've already been contacted alone because of the social media on the football field. People want to come and rent the facility. So we want to make sure that we have this all ready to go and a fee structure should that happen, so that it could maybe pay for itself over time as well.
In the future, so the time frame is in the next month, because we think the turf field will be finished by then, and the basketball court, so
Marvin and Craig have already researched how other school districts with similar facilities, the hourly rate is similar to a $300 or $500 an hour plus the services of someone to be there. And then locally, we would have a discounted rate to local community members who would participate here, would not pay as much as an outside agency coming in to use the complex.
that's currently handled.
No, right now, we were not really collecting many fees for the use of the facilities.
There's no, currently, there's no listed fee for a outdoor field. So if you were to rent, say, the previous football field or the Drexel Hill or Beverly Hills football field, there's no fees directly associated with the use of that property. If there's an employee that has to be there to maintain or open, unlock a gate, supervise, there's a charge for the actual cost of a district employee being on site.
Any other questions or comments from the board? Okay. I think we can move on to our second agenda item, upcoming audits. Thank you.
Agenda item number 2 is the upcoming audit. This is also informational. We just like to come out and let the board know that annually we are required to have a financial audit done for each school year. That audit, typically, we have preliminary work that they come out in July or August. That has been completed. They only come out for a day or two. And then they come back in October and complete what they call their field work. From that, they compile a report. They review our financials. They then issue our audit report. The expectation, as it always is that that audit report be issued no later to the board to be approved, no later than the end of December. We have to be able to turn around and report back to the state and different agencies for other purposes. So that's always been the deadline. And again, I just want to reiterate, it obviously continues to be that deadline. But we just want you to be aware that, again, we're going through that cycle this time of year. And our auditors will be on site in the beginning of October to perform their field work.
What was the months again for the preliminary part that's already been completed? What month did you say?
They typically try to come out sometime in July or August. This year, they kind of pushed it up on us. They had a scheduling conflict. So it was it was even earlier in July this year, but we made it work.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the board? Okay. We'll move on to agenda item number 3, policies.
So policy is going to require board action tonight. We have 7 policies associated with really 2 major topics. The first 4 are 003, BOG 1, Board Policy and Development Process, 005, BOG for Organization, 005, BOG 2, Committee of the Whole, 005, BOG 3, Function of the Committee of the Whole, and then we have 810, Transportation, and under 810 is your 810.1, which is associated with drug and alcohol testing for covered drivers, and 810.3 for school vehicle drivers. I'll come back to the 800s, but before doing so, I know that Mr. Desnoyers would like to speak towards the actual BOGs.
Good evening, my fellow board members, Superintendent McGarry, administrators, staff, and members of the school district community. I would like to make an extended comment on the proposed policy changes that will create a standing policy committee. The driving force behind the creation of a standing policy committee was and is to make policy consideration and adoption more transparent. The two policy committee co-chairs will be readily identifiable as the board members with whom the community can communicate about policy questions and concerns. In addition, having dedicated staff to perform all policy-related research and prepare policy changes should lead to more uniform policies. And with the new Standing Policy Committee meeting each month solely to review and discuss proposed policy changes, this will elevate the status of policymaking, which happens to be a primary duty of the board. The changes that went through a first reading at the August 13th board meeting, though, propose a change to the policy adoption timeline. The current policy adoption timeline is as follows. There's a first reading at the month 1 board meeting. Then there's review and discussion of changes at the month 1 committee meeting. Finally, there's a second reading and adoption at the month 2 board meeting. That is, of course, unless substantial changes are made after the first reading, at which the policy goes back for another first reading at a subsequent board meeting. The changes to Policy 005 and the 3 BOGs, 003 BOG 1, 005 BOG 2, and 005 BOG 3, that went through a first reading at the August 13th board meeting envision a compressed policy adoption timeline. The proposed compressed policy adoption timeline is as follows. First reading along with review and discussion at month 1 committee meeting. The second reading and adoption at the month 2 board meeting 2 weeks later. That is, again, unless substantial changes are made after the first reading, at which point the policy goes back for another first reading and further review and discussion at a subsequent committee meeting. Concerns have been raised with the proposed compressed timeline for policy adoption. I look forward to hearing the thoughts of my fellow board members and the community on 2 aspects of the proposed Standing Policy Committee. First, the proposed formation of a Standing Policy Committee itself, and second, the proposed compressed policy adoption timeline. I would like to take this opportunity to remind my fellow board members that they have a few different options this evening when it comes to acting on these proposed policy changes. The board can give consensus to moving these policy changes forward to the September 10th board meeting for a second reading and adoption. The board can decline to give consensus, in which case no further action will be taken on the proposed Standing Policy Committee. And third, the board can table the proposed changes pending further review and discussion. Thank you.
Any comments from the board on Mr. Desnoyer's statement?
Yeah, would that standing committee, so would that be like a public meeting for discussion? Right?
Yes,
And that'd be
would
once a month?
That would meet once a month on the same night as the other 2 committees, the Education,
Okay.
People Services, and Finance and Operations. And it would be a meeting of the policy committee solely devoted to reviewing and discussing proposed policy changes.
And that would be the reason for the compressed timeline of policy approval, because it's a public discussion.
A policy committee, a standing policy committee can be established using the current policy adoption timeline of first reading at month 1 board meeting, review and discussion at month 1 committee meeting, and second reading and adoption at month 2 board meeting. So we can keep the current timeline, but move to a standing policy committee that is dedicated solely to policy.
So I'll just comment on that, the proposed compressed timeline now. I think, in order for us to do our due diligence and really review policy is key. Policy is important as far as how we govern and things we put in place for the district. I think more time is better. I'm not in favor of a compressed timeline to have less time to review things and to consider it. So I would, in my opinion, I would like to maintain our current timeline.
Mr. Desnoyers, is your vision for the new standing policy committee that you would be working with, like you've been doing and like Mrs. Jordan did prior to you taking over the policy committee, that you would be able to tell people like what's coming up in the pipeline for policy changes, or would it just strictly be the first reading after the committee? I don't know if there's a staff person here who might be able to speak to that, maybe Dr. McGarry. I know we get alerts from PSBA ahead of time. Would we be able to say these are what's on our radar, or this is what we're focusing on? I'm just wondering what the benefits are of having the standalone policy committee are.
So, advance notice would continue to be provided. For instance, for next month, a few weeks ago, the policy group made the decision that the use of facilities policy or policies would be reviewed in September. And Dr. McGarry and Mr. Rogers have brought that up tonight, and I think it was mentioned at the last board meeting. So that would still occur. The difficulty is that we have been informed that board members, in order for board members to meet and discuss policy, that has to occur in a public setting. And if it's not a standing policy committee, then each meeting has to be advertised. And there is enough policy work that I would expect an ad hoc policy committee that currently exists would have to meet almost every month. So it would involve advertising a meeting almost every month and holding a meeting. And I'm also not clear if doing things that way, continuing with an ad hoc policy committee, would mean that on committee meeting nights, education and pupil services policies would be reviewed in the Education and Pupil Services Committee meeting. Finance and Operations policies would be reviewed in the Finance and Operations Committee meeting. And then all policies would be reviewed again in the Policy Committee meeting. So I'm a bit unclear as to how it would work if we continue the current setup. Mm-hmm. And I will say again that the reason for this proposed change is we've been given direction that the Policy Committee meetings have to be public.
Administratively, the process, and Ms. Jordan was a part of it, and the process I thought was one where, yes, we've received updates and there's administrative pieces, and if you study the process as far as it's concerned, first and second readings, Kyle, I know that you're here, I don't want to single you out, but we have a first and second reading process, but there is no requirement of how we do things. We've upward RBI'd that in the sense that we do it this way historically. That's number one. Number two, I felt this discussion that I understood it to be, and Neil, you obviously jump in if it's not accurate, but part of the concern is that if at a board meeting, when you go to a first reading, when we say compressed or not compressed, it feels compressed a little bit anyway, because the first reading, there's no discussion on the policy. And I think administratively, our concern is, why we bring a policy to the first reading, no discussion happens, go to a committee meeting and we shoot it down. So the opposite, I think, administratively was our understanding, was a policy committee was going to be formed as the board had asked, so that we would go to a first reading at a committee meeting, so it would allow public input there, instead of what had happened in the past, certain policies that I will not bring up that will bring up some bad memories. But it went to a first reading, then it comes to a committee meeting, and then it becomes, oh, we're not going to move it forward. The administration's thought process, as this was brought forward, was we're going to have a policy committee that's going to meet prior to the other two committees to discuss the policies before they went to a first reading, so that we could avoid this idea of the board and the public being in a back and forth, not agreeing to what it is. Not that that's always unhealthy, there's good things that come from that. But to garner the support and this public this conversation around things such as tonight's, if there was a policy about going forward with snow days and things of that nature. So administratively, I was on the impression, or at least we were, when we were putting this process together, that we were going to discuss at a first reading Instead of right now, the process is, if you're familiar, obviously, with the public that's here that's new, first reading, it just goes through and there's no discussion. And our concern administratively is we'd like to see discussion with the board or with the administration about the issues so it can be fixed. Because while we talk about compressed and not compressed, the other issue administratively is there are things that have to happen, and we're talking about potentially a long period of time to make positive change as well. So I agree with you, if it's being presented as compressed in a negative way, to your point where it sounds like it is, Mr. Brown, which we don't want to have happen, I thought the initiative was, let's talk about it at a first reading to prevent those issues from happening. And I thought that was part of the process that administratively that was being presented to us from the board to have this process happen. But I know, Kyle, you've joined the table, so.
Right, so as a starting point, the process that you follow here is entirely voluntary. The law doesn't say that you have to have this extended process of reviewing policy before adopting it. In theory, and I'm not recommending this, but in theory, you could propose a policy and adopt it the same night if you really wanted to. As far as the process that is being proposed now, I wasn't part of deciding what that process would be, but I certainly have looked over the policies that were proposed. It doesn't preclude you from having presentation at one meeting, having discussion at the next meeting, and adopting at the third. It doesn't really require that you make it a very short timeline. It certainly allows for it, though. So I'm not in any sense disputing that. And the other thing is that if you decided that you didn't want to have the timeline change, but still wanted to create this policy that would be a central clearinghouse for policies, that the only place that you need to make a change from what is proposed here is in the 003 BOG 1 policy, not the others. So the policy relating to the creation and authority, so to speak, of the policy committee resides in the other policy changes that are being discussed here. And finally, I just wanted to address the whole notion of public versus not public. My understanding is that the way that, or my experience with the way that the administration put together potential policy changes previously wasn't actually a meeting. So it wasn't that it was any notion of a closed meeting that was going on. That wasn't the case. It was simply that the administration was essentially creating the policies, running them by a member of the board, and then presenting them in the public for public discussion.
Correct.
This would change that so that there would actually be more board involvement in the creation of the policy.
And if we were to not go in that direction, Kyle, is it still possible to what we're saying, how we have the committees running now, this is an administrative question, you could still have that committee functioning similarly, but keep Education and People Services knowing that Mr. Desnoyers and another board member were functioning within those as the policy piece instead of a standalone policy committee, correct? Essentially keeping it the same way.
There's no reason that you can't. I'm not sure whether you're talking about to use an educational model to push in to the other committees, or whether you're talking about the idea that there'd be some oversight by the policy committee.
So, board members have expressed, so there exists an ad hoc policy committee now. Board members have expressed a strong desire for the policy committee to meet, and that means public meetings. So that this has to be worked out.
Can you clarify whether you said we could meet publicly or not publicly, the ad hoc policy committee, please?
The policy committee, even as an ad hoc, did not meet previously. There was a liaison from the board that met with the administration. It was not a public meeting. It wasn't a non-public meeting. It wasn't a meeting. It was simply a member of the board would get together with the administration to go over potential policies.
But the ad hoc committee that he just described, what are the rules on how we can meet? Multiple members of the board.
Any committee, whether it's ad hoc or not, would have to be public and would have to be publicly advertised.
Okay.
My understanding is that, and my experience has been that the policy, this ad hoc committee has never actually met in my time with the district. It's been individuals that have gotten together with the administration, individually.
All right, so the proposal is to add a policy committee. So currently, the Education and Pupil Services Committee and the Finance and Operations Committee, they meet and, discuss the agenda. So then we're going to add the policy committee. So then that's 6 board members who will be part of a committee. So obviously, you couldn't all meet at the same time, which is currently, I think, what's happening with the 2 committees. You kind of piggyback off of each other. So this would have to be separate, not to violate any of the sunshine. And just to go through, so a policy committee take tonight would be at the table. You would discuss, there wouldn't be any readings. You'd be saying, these are the policies that were,
So at,
just walk me through that.
on the nights of committee meetings, there would be 3 committees that met: the Education Pupil Services, the Finance and Operations, and the Policy committees. Policies that were up for review, changes, adoptions, etc., would be presented by a member of administration, and members of the board and members of the public would have the opportunity to question and get further details on any policy changes, policy deletions, new policy adoptions, etc. And then, at the
board
board,
meeting.
we would then adopt policy separate from the review and discussion at a subsequent board meeting.
Any other questions or comments on that, on the Boggs from the board on the policy committee? Okay, we'll give it back, put it back in Mr. Craig's hands for the other policies. You said you'll come back to the others.
The next few policies are the 810 series. They have to do with transportation. 810.1 is the drug and alcohol testing for covered drivers. We're really just updating some of the language, kind of bringing it up to the current day language, PSBA recommendations, so on and so forth. The 810.3 is actually for school vehicle drivers. That is a new policy that does not exist right now. It's really, what we're doing is memorializing what we already are practice. So we have CDL drivers, which are bus drivers, and then we have individuals who drive vans that do not require CDLs. So we hold them to the same standard as a bus driver because they're transporting our students. So we want to memorialize that same policy for van drivers versus bus drivers to make sure that we're just memorializing what our practice is.
And how about the others, the next one?
That was, so 810's just, again,
Oh, they're all.
they all
part of
fall
the-
under
okay.
810, so
Okay. Any questions or comments from the board on those policies?
Do we ever talk about cell phone use for the drivers? Because as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of just as dangerous as alcohol or, some drug abuse, so.
Absolutely. Cell phone is very dangerous on the school bus. Obviously, our mission is to provide safe and reliable services to our students, and cell phone is not helping us. To be completely honest, in the past, we couldn't really police the cell phone usage in the past because we were having a shortage of the bus drivers. But this year, we hired at the first day of the school, we had more than 20 extra drivers So we have a lot more power to hold our people accountable. So whenever we see any kind of like a cell phone usage, we can penalize our drivers, and also, we can make actions. Yeah.
The changes to the transportation policies include language that says, what is it? Cell phone use consists of pressing more than one button
yeah, I saw that.
so it does have specific language in there to say what operators can do and what operators can't do. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's in the policy, yes.
So Marvin, I just wanted to ask you a question about the cell phone use, and I agree, cell phone use is dangerous on a bus when these drivers are driving and we want to keep our kids safe. I know one of the things, I've had parents reach out to me who have their children transported to private schools from the transportation, and so because they're not connected and they're calling, like on days when busing is different, their schools are open. And so I'm just curious about that population as well, that is they're getting services from our transportation. Parents are not knowing how to communicate, and I know a lot of them would get the phone numbers of the bus driver and be calling the bus driver if there was, somebody was late or a bus didn't show up and so how do you propose talking to those parents? Because they're not, of course, they're district parents, but they're sending their children to different schools.
Our practice is to pull the bus to a safe spot and use the cell phone. They are not supposed to use a cell phone while out there driving. Yes.
Any other comments or questions from the board? Okay, then we're going to move to public comment. Please come up to the microphone, state your name, your address, and the agenda item that you have a comment about.
Suzanne Brittis, 319 Austin Drive. I had 2 agenda items. One, I wanted to clarify with the facilities fees. Is this strictly for new fields, or will there be fees now assessed to like Drexel Hill Middle School and other fields that have not had the improvements made to them?
It's strictly the turf field and track at the high
Okay.
school at this point. As we continue to improve the facilities across the district, though, they will be assessed.
Okay, thank you. And then I had regarding the policies. Historically, prior to the 2014 change in community engagement, the public was able to discuss the first reading policies at the first reading. But at this point in time, I feel like the first reading serves as a notification to the public. So my concern would be that as it stands right now for committee meetings, the agendas and the presentations, they go on the website on Tuesday mornings, sometimes Tuesday afternoon, depending on if there's last minute changes. To me, that's too late to notify people, especially if it's a more impactful policy that's being discussed. So to me, the first reading at this point, because of the change in engagement, serves more as a notification for the public. And I feel like that needs to be preserved. If we're going to get rid of that, I feel like we should at least add into the policy that any potential policy changes being discussed at the committee meeting might be posted so many days prior to a committee meeting, and have that language added into the policy to ensure the public has their notification or engagement consideration being taken seriously. So, thank you.
Timothy Kelly, 730 Belfield Avenue. For agenda item number 3 with regards to the policies. I don't like saying this, but I have to agree with Mr. Brown that the extra time might be worthwhile because, again, with these types of discussions, it's opportunity for me go back to the Home and School Association, Arana, to talk about if there is something that people then are aware of it, because again, it goes to kind of goal number 1, community involvement. So this would be something that then the Home and School Association, if they had concerns, they would be able to attend the next meeting, because obviously we can't always attend every committee meeting that comes up. Some parents are more attentive at the Home and School meeting, so that would be one way they can get some feedback or at least have a chance to come to the next committee meeting so I would tend to agree with Ed. The current process seems to give at least allow for some time, but so.
So, Mr. Rogers, please review the agenda items that you covered this evening.
Agenda item number 1 was use of facilities. which was informational. Number 2 is upcoming audit, also informational, and policy, which will require board action. Would you like me to review each one individually?
Yes, I think we're voting on them, I guess, individually. So yeah, if you can just do a quick brief, just go through each of them.
We'll start with 003, BOG 1, Board Policy Development Process.
I would be in favor of tabling it.
Rest of the board, where are we? Do we want to move it forward? Do we want to table it? Do you want to table it? Okay. So I think enough questions and issues were raised, so I think we're going to table the board policy development process.
Next is 005, BOG Organization.
I would like to table that.
Any other table? Okay. Okay,
Yes, table it.
table it, okay. So that's table for the first two. More discussion.
The third is 005, BOG 2, Committee of the Whole.
I would like to table that.
I still think it would be beneficial for us to consider in the future having a policy committee as part of the current committee structure that we have as committee of the whole. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. I hope that we'll look at this again in the near future. I don't think it would be a bad thing for us to really talk a little bit more in depth about policies. Like even tonight, on both the agendas, there was things that could make it to a policy, a first read. The use of facilities and the flexible instructional days, those could have been discussed in the policy committee with co-chairs having a little bit, working on that alongside the administration to help garner support and also to really understand it. So I hope that we look at it in the near future.
I have a question. So just looking at the policies, as Kyle said, the 003 BOG 1 is the only one that's affected by the timeline. So if we are considering, if we all want a policy committee, then we should be approving to move forward all of the other ones and then tabling 003 BOG 1 just to talk about what the timing of it would be, right? Is that correct or no?
My preference would be to move all the changes together, as opposed to doing them individually.
Please.
Mrs. Brittis's point, I think, is a very valid point, as well as Mr. Kelly's, to the notification piece. Administratively, the only comment that I have is a first reading without some kind of discussion on it is administratively is concerning, because I think it creates this, and I like the idea it's a notification, but it also sometimes creates a rubber stamp, for lack of a better term, of no discussion about a policy that may be a concerning policy. So administratively, our thought process after this was brought up to us to make these changes was there isn't a discussion at a first reading to prevent it from becoming a mess later on. And that's what we really don't want to have happen administratively. We don't want policy to come forward necessarily and create consternation. So maybe one of the future considerations too would be discussion at a first reading. But that's down the line, that's all.
Kyle, just as a formatting question, could a committee of the whole technically meet on the board meeting night for just strictly for policy so that the first reading of the policy could enter in discussion and question phase? Okay, so maybe that's something that we might want to consider as well.
Okay, so all these, there's overlap with all of these BOGs, so I think the consensus is to table them and, it warrants more discussion. There's some good points brought up by Dr. Taylor and by President Mitchell. So we will table the BOGs and we'll talk about the transportation. Let's move down to that one. Certainly, Ms. Curry.
I'm okay with tabling it, but I just want to, when are we coming back around to it? That's what I want to know. We need to make a decision about when this is going to happen. So it's okay to table it so we can discuss it a little bit more, but we really need to make it definitive as the new school year is moving forward.
And in conversations, at least our understanding with Mr. Desnoyers is he wants to generate more conversation around the policies to gather more community input before they get voted on. So we can talk about down the line, maybe coming back forward with maybe one of the first steps is discussion, as you said, a meeting before the board meeting and a discussion at a first reading potentially.
Good point. Okay. Transportation,
Policy 810.
810, transportation. Do we want to move that one forward? Yes. Okay. Drug, alcohol testing, 810.1.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And 810.3, school vehicle drivers.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think that's it. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Meeting adjourned.